Hello everyone. In this video we are going to discuss about the scheduler and its different types. So whenever we talk about the scheduler, it is an operating system program which is basically selecting the job from the ready queue for execution purpose. The main purpose for using this kind of scheduler is to increase the CPU utilization as well as the throughput. Fine. So if we see the different type of schedulers available, we can have three types. First one is long-term scheduler, second one is medium-term scheduler, and third one is short-term schedulers. So let us understand in detail about the three types of schedulers. So as you can see on the screen, this is the diagram or queuing diagram for all the three types of schedulers. So let me start with the first one, that is long-term scheduler. This long-term scheduler is known as job scheduler because it is going to determine which job is to be submitted for processing purpose. Fine. So whenever we are executing certain group of jobs which are kept on the disk, so what the main purpose of this long-term scheduler is that it is going to select the job or the process from the disk and it is allowed to load them onto the main memory for the execution. Fine. So basically the long-term scheduler is having the batch of jobs, as you can see here. This batch jobs or group of jobs we are placing in the batch queue. Now the work of this long-term scheduler is to load these programs which are there on the batch queue onto the ready queue. So whenever you are using the long-term scheduler, there should be a careful selection of the process. When we say careful selection of the process, that means those process should be a mixture of input output bound process as well as CPU bound processes. Why we are saying that we should have a good mix? Because the input output bound process will spend more time performing the input output operation rather than doing the computation. Whereas when we talk about the CPU bounded process, it is going to perform the CPU computation rather than going for input output request. Okay, so this is the main work of long-term scheduler, that it is going to fetch the job from the batch queue, placing it in the ready queue and allocating the CPU, and whenever there is a certain kind of operations to be performed, like if the process or the job requires certain kind of input output operations to be performed, that job is removed from the CPU and placed in the input output waiting queue for performing different kind of input output operations. And once those input output operations are done, it is placed again back into the ready queue for processing purpose. Or else we can have one more thing here. So whenever we are having certain CPU bound process in the long term scheduler and it needs to perform certain CPU computation, so we are removing that process from the CPU, hence we call it as swap out. That means we are swapping out the job from the CPU and placing it in the suspended and swapped out queues, because we are suspending it or keeping it in a queue so that it can perform certain operations like input output operations or CPU bound operations or CPU bound computations. Fine. So once it is done, we are going to swap in once again. That means we are going to place the job again in the ready queue, indicating that the particular process or job is ready for execution and it can be allocated with the CPU so that it can complete with the processing. So this is about the long-term scheduling. The second one comes medium-term scheduler. As I have already told you, the medium-term schedulers can be used for performing certain input-output operations, wherein the process can be swapped out from the CPU or away from the CPU processing and we can perform certain IO operations and place it back into the ready queue. So hence here you can see I have written medium term scheduler for twice. Okay, so that it can perform the IO operations, or due to certain CPU computation we are suspending them. As far as the short term scheduling is concerned, the main task of this short term scheduler is to allocate process or the job which is present in the ready queue to the CPU. Okay, and it is immediately getting the processor and finishing with the execution. The main reason for using this short term scheduler is to maximize the CPU requirement. I hope you people understood what exactly the scheduler is and what are the different type of schedulers.